She'll do," the Duke of Blackwood muttered, his voice a low rasp of sound in the cavernous, chilled assembly hall. The words were not meant for her, Elara Vance, but for the marriage broker at his elbow, a man whose waistcoat was too tight and whose smile was a smear of grease. Yet the words found her anyway, a dart of ice lodging itself in her ribs. She stood on the low dais with 5 other women, a collection of debts and dowries, of pretty faces and desperate circumstances, all displayed under the flat, unforgiving light of a London afternoon. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze from the far wall, where a tapestry depicted a grim-faced stag brought down by a pack of hounds. She had been brought down, and here were the hounds, assessing the kill. The Duke was a spectre of drawing-room gossip, a man of immense wealth and title who had not been seen in society for a decade. He was taller than she'd imagined, a pillar of black wool and stark angles, his face a composition of shadows and sharp lines. A scar, white and thin as a thread, cut through one dark eyebrow, giving him an expression of permanent, severe disapproval. He did not look at her face. His gaze was a brief, dismissive sweep, the kind a man might give a horse he was considering for his stables. It assessed her posture, the plain but well-mended grey of her dress, the way her hands were clasped at her waist, still and steady. He had been in the room for less than 5 minutes. He had glanced at the other women, one prettier, one younger, one with a more notable family name, however tarnished, and passed them over without a flicker of interest. Then his eyes had landed on her, and stopped. She'll do. 3 words, the summation of her life, the final nail in the coffin of the girl she had once been. The broker scurried forward, rubbing his hands together. "An excellent choice, Your Grace. Miss Vance is of good family. Temperament as placid as a summer lake, I am assured." Elara knew her temperament was more akin to a winter sea, deep and cold and capable of immense fury, but she held her tongue. Her compliance had been bought and paid for. The Duke's gaze, finally, reluctantly, lifted to her face. His eyes were the colour of slate, hard and impenetrable. There was no warmth in them, no curiosity, only a flat, pragmatic assessment. He was not choosing a wife. He was acquiring a household fixture. "The contracts will be drawn up," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He turned, his greatcoat swirling around him like a dark wing, and walked toward the exit without a backward glance. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a sound of profound finality. It was the sound of one life ending and another, impossibly beginning. She was no longer Elara Vance, the disgraced daughter, the abandoned fiancée. She was a bargain struck in a cold room, a solution to a problem she did not understand, for a man who looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture. Why her? The question was a silent scream in the hollow space where her heart used to be. Why the plain one, the one with no dowry and a ruined name? What did he see in her that he could possibly want? The broker was chattering, his relief a palpable thing, but she did not hear him. She watched the door, the solid, unyielding wood that separated her from a past of calculated cruelty and a future of cold, terrifying indifference. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe for more stories of love found in the most unexpected circumstances, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The story of Elara Vance and the Duke of Blackwood is only just beginning. Her life before that cold assembly hall had been a lesson in the fine print of filial duty. She was the unrecognized architect of her family's solvency, the silent partner in her fiancé's ambitions. Her father, Baron Vance, was a man who loved the idea of wealth more than the work required to maintain it. It was Elara, with her sharp mind for figures and her quiet, methodical nature, who had managed the dwindling estate accounts since she was 16. It was she who stretched shillings into pounds, who negotiated with creditors, who saw the rot in the ledgers, and did her best to shore up the crumbling foundations. No one acknowledged it. Her work was as invisible and as essential as the air she breathed. Her mother had passed years ago, leaving her with a stepmother who saw Ilara's competence not as a virtue, but as a quiet reproach to her own indolence. Her half-sisters, frivolous and cruel in the way of the perpetually bored, called her the little grey mouse for her simple dresses and her habit of spending evenings in the estate office rather than the drawing-room. Her only solace had been Anna, a young housemaid with kind eyes, who would bring her a cup of tea late at night and speak to her as if she were a person, not a function. Then came Lord Harrington, a man as handsome as a painting and as hollow as a drum. He saw in Ilara not a woman to love, but an asset to be exploited. He courted her with pretty words, praising her sensible mind, while he handed her the tangled ledgers of his own failing properties. For 2 years she had worked a quiet miracle, untangling his debts, restructuring his rents, making him appear solvent, successful. He promised marriage, a future, a partnership. She had allowed herself, foolishly, to believe him. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and brutal. It arrived on a Tuesday, over a breakfast of cold toast and watery jam. Harrington, resplendent in a new coat she knew he could not afford, announced that their engagement was at an end. He was to marry the daughter of a shipping magnate, a girl with a fortune that could truly secure his future. "It is for the best, my dear Ilara," he'd said, his tone one of magnanimous pity. "A man in my position requires more. You understand?" He did not mention that it was the very illusion of success she had built for him that had attracted the heiress in the first place. That afternoon, her father had called her into his study. The air was thick with the scent of brandy and defeat. He informed her that his final creditor had called in his marker. The estate was lost. Everything was lost. And to cover the last of his personal debts, he had sold her marriage contract to a London broker. There was no other way. He'd mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "You are a sensible girl. You will do your duty." She was ejected, cast out not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen on a contract. She packed a single valise, her hands steady. She did not weep. The capacity for tears had been burned out of her long ago. As she left, she passed Anna on the stairs, pressing a small, saved coin into the girl's hand. It was Anna who cried. The journey to London, the stay in the broker's cold townhouse, the final indignity of the assembly hall, it all passed in a grey blur. She had become a commodity, her worth assessed and her future sold to the highest, or perhaps only bidder. The Duke of Blackwood had not been bidding. He had been acquiring. And as she stood on that dais, the echo of his words, "She'll do," was not an insult. It was a diagnosis. She was a thing that would suffice. The journey to Blackwood Manor took 2 days by carriage. The Duke did not accompany her. A silent footman and a stern-faced lady's companion were her only escorts. They spoke only when necessary, their clipped tones reinforcing her status as cargo being delivered. Ilara watched the rolling hills give way to stark, wind-swept moorland, the landscape growing more severe with every mile. The manor, when it finally appeared, was not a house but a fortress. It rose from the moor like a crag of granite, a vast Gothic structure of dark stone and narrow leaded windows. There were no welcoming lights, no signs of life, only the cry of the wind against its implacable walls. The air inside was colder than the air outside. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and silence, the flagstones worn smooth by generations of footsteps, the tapestries on the walls faded to ghosts of their former colour. A woman stood waiting for her, as tall and unyielding as the house itself. Her dress was black bombazine, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. "I am Mrs. Finch," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "The housekeeper. His Grace has instructed me to show you to your rooms." The tour was brief. "Mrs." Finch pointed out the dining room, the drawing room, the library, all vast, immaculate, and utterly unused. The furniture was shrouded in dust covers. The air was stale with disuse. The staff, when she caught glimpses of them, were wraiths who flitted down corridors and vanished through doorways, their faces averted. Her rooms were in the east wing, a suite of chambers that were spacious and grand, but as impersonal as a hotel. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but not lit. "His Grace will expect you for dinner at 8. Mrs. Finch stated. "A maid will be sent to assist you. Her name is Beatrice." Then she was gone, leaving Alara alone in the echoing silence. The Duke appeared in the dining room at precisely 8 o'clock. He wore a simple black coat, his presence filling the immense room. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table, long enough to seat 30. A single candelabra between them cast flickering shadows, making the distance feel even greater. The meal was served by silent footmen, a clear soup, a roasted duck, a simple pudding. He did not speak. He ate with an economy of movement, his attention fixed on his plate. Alara ate what she could, her own silence a shield. When the plates were cleared, he finally looked at her, his slate-grey eyes assessing her across the expanse of polished wood. "I trust your journey was satisfactory," he said. It was not a question so much as a perfunctory statement. "It was, Your Grace," she replied, her own voice sounding small in the vastness. He inclined his head slightly. "I will be plain, madam, so there are no misunderstandings between us. This is a marriage of convenience. I require a duchess to manage my household and to put a stop to the endless parade of hopeful mothers who besiege my solicitor. You require a home and security. This is the extent of our arrangement." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You will have full authority over the domestic staff and the household accounts. You will have a generous allowance for your personal use. You will want for nothing material. In return, you will be discreet, you will be efficient, and you will not trouble me with emotion or expectation. I offer you my name and my protection. I do not offer you my company or my confidence. Is that understood?" The terms were laid out like a business proposal, cold and clear. There was no pretense, no false sentiment. It was an honest transaction, and in its stark honesty there was a strange kind of relief. It was a world away from Lord Harrington's suffocating lies. Cold indifference was a landscape she knew she could survive. Active cruelty was not. "Perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "The terms are acceptable." For the first time, a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, crossed his face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Very well," he said, pushing back his chair. "Mrs. Finch will provide you with the household ledgers in the morning." He stood, gave a stiff, formal bow, and left the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until they faded into the profound silence of the house. Alara sat alone at the long table, the candles guttering, a duchess in name, a stranger in her own home. In the days that followed, Alara learned the rhythms of Blackwood Manor. It was a house holding its breath. The silence was not peaceful. It was watchful. She began her work in the estate office, a small, cold room adjacent to the library. Mrs. Finch delivered the ledgers with an air of profound skepticism, placing them on the desk as if they were sacred texts being handed over to a heretic. The books were neat, the columns of figures precise, but Ilara's trained eye saw the story beneath the numbers. The estate was not failing, but it was stagnant, bleeding money through 1,000 small inefficiencies. Contracts with local suppliers were decades old, their terms never renegotiated. The steward, a Mr. Davies, was paying premium prices for substandard goods out of sheer inertia. Staffing levels were bloated in some areas and skeletal in others. It was a household run by habit, not by logic. She started small. She spent a day walking the grounds, her plain dress catching on overgrown briars. The gardens were a ruin. Once grand rose trellises had collapsed into a tangle of thorns, pathways were choked with weeds, and a beautiful old glass house stood with half its panes shattered. It was a perfect metaphor for the man who owned it, a place of immense potential, left to decay. She found an elderly groundskeeper, a man named Thomas, who seemed to be the only person left tending the vast expanse. He showed her the old plans, his gnarled fingers tracing the lines of forgotten flower beds and orchards. Together they began the slow work of reclamation, starting with a small walled kitchen garden. She discovered the staff moved like ghosts because they were terrified of their master. The Duke, Alistair, was a phantom in his own home, a presence felt but rarely seen. Yet he saw everything. Ilara would be in the estate office, her head bent over an invoice, and feel a shift in the air. She would look up to see him standing in the doorway to the library, watching her, his face an unreadable mask. He would hold her gaze for a moment, then turn and disappear into the shadows of the shelves. Beatrice, the young maid assigned to her, was a quiet, observant girl with gentle hands. She did not chatter, but her presence was a small, warm comfort. She learned Ilara's preferences without being told, bringing her a shawl when the evening chill set in, ensuring the fire in her sitting room was always lit. The staff's suspicion began to thaw. When Ilara renegotiated the contract for flour with a new mill, saving the estate a considerable sum, Mrs. Finch offered a curt nod of approval that felt like a torrent of praise. When she exposed Mr. Davies's lazy dealings and hinted at something more dishonest, the steward was dismissed, and a younger, more vigorous man was hired on her recommendation. The Duke approved the change with a single written note. They continued to take their evening meals in silence, two distant figures at opposite ends of the long table. But the silence began to change. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of strangers. It became a shared space, a quiet coexistence. One night, unable to sleep, she went to the library. A fire was burning low in the grate, the room filled with the scent of leather and old paper. She found him there, in a wingback chair, a book open in his lap. He looked up as she entered, but said nothing. She did not retreat. She selected a book from the shelves, took a seat in the chair opposite his, and began to read. For over an hour they sat together, the only sounds the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of turning pages. When she finally rose to leave, he spoke, his voice low. "Good night, Duchess." "Good night, Your Grace," she replied, and for the first time it did not feel entirely like a lie. Ilara found her rhythm in the steady work of restoration. The kitchen garden began to produce herbs and vegetables, their vibrant green a stark contrast to the grey stone of the manor walls. The household accounts, once a tangled mess of waste and neglect, were now balanced to the penny, a model of efficiency. She was not happy, for happiness was a luxury she had long since learned to do without, but she was settled. The cold indifference she had anticipated had proven to be a kind of freedom. No one demanded she smile. No one required her to be charming. She was valued for her competence, and for Ilara that was a novel and deeply satisfying experience. Her greatest project became the main library. It was the heart of the house, a magnificent two-story room lined with thousands of books. But it was disorganized, coated in a fine layer of dust. With Beatrice's help, she began the monumental task of cataloguing the collection. It was during this process, while working in a far corner of the upper gallery, that she made the discovery. Tucked behind a row of crumbling theological texts was a slim folio bound in dark green leather, unmarked and out of place. Curiosity piqued, she slid it from the shelf. It was not a book, but a collection of documents held together with a faded ribbon. The papers were letters, legal correspondence, and financial statements, all dating back over the last 5 years. Her breath caught in her chest. The first letter was from her own father, Baron Vance, to the previous Duke of Blackwood, Alistair's father. It was a desperate plea for an extension on a loan, one of many. She saw, in stark black ink, the history of her family's financial ruin, a debt passed from father to son. But it was the more recent documents that made the blood drain from her face. There was a letter from the Duke's solicitor, dated just weeks before her arrival in London. It detailed the final collapse of her father's estate and the sale of his last remaining asset, her marriage contract, sold to a broker to settle a gambling debt. And then, the final devastating piece of paper, a bill of sale. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, had purchased that contract from the broker for the sum of £5,000. Her presence here was no accident of the Assembly Hall. He hadn't simply chosen her from a lineup of desperate women. He had sought her out. He had orchestrated her arrival. The cold, transactional nature of their arrangement suddenly felt like a lie, but she could not decipher the shape of the truth that lay beneath it. Was this an act of pity, a rescue, or something far more calculating? The trust she had begun to build, the quiet respect she had felt growing between them, fractured. She felt like a specimen again, acquired for a purpose she did not understand. That evening she did not wait for dinner. She went to his study, a room she had never before entered, and found him at his desk, surrounded by maps of his vast northern territories. She placed the green folio on the polished wood between them. She did not speak, merely watched his face. He looked down at the documents, then up at her. His expression was as controlled as ever, but she saw the tightening of his jaw, a subtle shift in the hard line of his mouth. "You found this in the library?" he stated. "I did," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I believe it requires an explanation." He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in the silence. He did not dissemble. He did not deny. "My solicitor keeps me apprised of the financial dealings of my peers," he began, his tone factual, as if discussing crop yields. "It is a matter of business. I was aware of your father's debts. I was also aware of Lord Harrington's. And I was aware," he continued, his gaze direct, "that the temporary improvement in Harrington's fortunes was not his own work. He knew. He had known all along about her silent, uncredited labor. My solicitor's reports were quite detailed. They spoke of a Miss Vance, a fiancée with a remarkable aptitude for finance, who had single-handedly salvaged his estates from the brink of collapse. A wave of cold shock washed over her. He had not just seen her. He had investigated her. When I learned Harrington had cast you aside and your father had sold your contract, I saw an opportunity," he said. "I required a duchess of substance, someone who could manage this estate with intelligence and autonomy. The assembly was a formality. I had already made my choice." It was all there, the cold, pragmatic logic. He had not bought a wife. He had hired a uniquely qualified estate manager, binding her with a marriage contract instead of a salary. The revelation should have felt insulting, yet it was laced with a strange, undeniable thread of respect. He had not chosen her for her beauty or her name, but for her mind. "You bought me," she said, the words tasting of ash. "Yes," he replied, without apology. "I did, and I would do it again." The air in the study was thick with unspoken things. Elara stood her ground, the discovery of his calculated acquisition settling not as anger, but as a cold, hard clarity. This was the man he was, pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness, a strategist who moved people like pieces on a chessboard. And she was his queen, placed in the center of the board for her utility. Before either of them could speak again, a footman appeared at the door, his face pale with alarm. "Your Grace," he stammered. "There is a visitor, a Lord Harrington. He insists on seeing the Duchess." Alistair's eyes narrowed, the slate grey hardening to flint. He looked at Elara, a silent question in his gaze. It was not, "Shall I send him away?" It was, "Are you ready?" She gave a single, sharp nod. The confrontation she had long dreaded was upon her, but she would not face it alone. They met him in the great hall. Harrington stood before the massive, cold hearth, looking entirely out of place in his fashionable London attire. He had the same handsome face, the same practiced, charming smile, but Elara saw him clearly now, a hollow man, propped up by vanity and deceit. His smile widened when he saw her. "Elara, my dear, I came as soon as I heard. Rushed all the way from town. I was so terribly worried." He cast a look of theatrical concern toward Alistair. "To hear you were wed to the Duke of Blackwood. Well, his reputation precedes him. I had to ensure you were safe, that you had not been coerced." It was a masterful performance, painting himself as the concerned former fiancé and Alistair as a villainous recluse. "I am quite safe, Lord Harrington," Elara said, her voice level, "and I was not coerced." Harrington's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Of course not, my dear, but this is no place for you. A cold northern fortress, miles from civilized society. It is my duty, as your former intended, to rescue you from this unfortunate situation. Come back to London with me. I will see you settled." He was not offering rescue. He was attempting to reclaim what he still saw as his property. He believed her marriage to a notorious duke was a social scandal he could exploit, perhaps even use as leverage to have the union annulled and regain control of her. Alistair had remained silent, a looming shadow at her side. Now he took a half-step forward, not in front of her, but beside her. His presence was a silent, unshakable wall. It was all the encouragement Elara needed. "You seem to be under a misapprehension, my lord," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength in the echoing hall. "You relinquished any claim to my welfare when you ended our engagement to pursue a fortune you had not earned. My life is my own, my marriage is my own. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and this is my home." She saw the flash of fury in his eyes before he masked it with a wounded expression. "Elara, he has turned you against me. Can you not see?" "On the contrary," she replied, the words as clear and cold as ice. "I see you perfectly for the first time. You have no business here. I must ask you to leave." Harrington's face contorted with rage. He turned on Alistair. "This is your doing. You will regret interfering." "The only thing I regret," Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "is that I did not purchase your debts along with her contract. Now get out of my house." He did not raise his voice, but the command had the force of a physical blow. Harrington, sputtering with indignation, but clearly intimidated, had no choice but to retreat. He threw one last, venomous look at Elara before the great doors were shut behind him. The silence he left behind was different. It was the silence of allies who had faced a common enemy. Elara's heart was hammering, but she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time in her life she had spoken back. She had claimed her own ground. She turned to Alistair. "Thank you." she said softly. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her face, an expression in his eyes she could not quite decipher. It was not pity or pride. It was something akin to discovery, as if he too were seeing her for the first time. The shared victory over Harrington forged a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between them. The polite distance remained, but it was now bridged by a current of mutual respect. They began to speak more during their silent evenings in the library, not of personal matters, but of the estate. She would show him her revised budgets, and he would listen intently, his sharp questions revealing a deep, if neglected, understanding of his own holdings. He, in turn, would unroll old architectural plans, showing her the original designs for the gardens, his long fingers tracing the ghost of a fountain or a forgotten rose walk. It was a partnership, formed not in a drawing room but over ledgers and blueprints. Elara threw herself into the restoration of the main gardens with renewed vigor. The work was hard, her hands often sore and stained with soil, but clearing the tangled weeds and breathing life back into the dormant earth felt like an act of healing for her own spirit. One cool evening, as dusk settled over the moor, Alistair found her in the west garden, wrestling with a climbing rose that had torn free from its trellis in a past storm. Its thorns snagged her sleeves and drew blood from her hands, but she was determined to save it. He watched her for a moment from the stone terrace, then descended the steps. He did not offer to take over, but simply took hold of the other side of the heavy, thorny vine. "It needs to be tied back higher," he said, his voice matter of fact. "The weight is pulling the support." They worked together in the fading light, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. Their hands brushed as she passed him a length of twine, and the brief contact was like a spark in the cool air. She felt a flush rise in her cheeks and was grateful for the gathering darkness. When the rose was finally secured, they stood back, two dark figures in the twilight, looking at their handiwork. "My mother planted this rose," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She loved this garden." It was the first time he had ever volunteered a piece of his personal history, a small, precious offering. Later that night, the house was still, the servants abed. Elara was in the library, unable to sleep, staring into the embers of the fire. She heard his footsteps and looked up to see him standing in the doorway. He came and stood by the mantelpiece, his shoulder almost brushing hers. The silence stretched, but it was comfortable, weighted with the easy camaraderie of their evening's work. "Harrington will not give up so easily," he said at last, his gaze on the dying fire. "He will try to ruin your reputation in London. He will paint you as an adventuress, and me as your captor." "Let him," she said quietly. "Words are only words. Sometimes they are more." He countered. He turned to face her, his expression serious, the firelight carving deep shadows on his face. "There is something you should know. A reason for my seclusion. A reason Harrington's accusations might find fertile ground." He told her then of his first marriage, years ago. A beautiful, charming woman from a celebrated family. He had been young and deeply in love. But she had not loved him. She had loved his title and his fortune, and she had conspired with his own cousin to embezzle a vast sum from the estate. The betrayal had been absolute, not just financial, but emotional. It had culminated in a scandalous public divorce that had left him shattered and deeply distrustful of the world and everyone in it. He had retreated to Blackwood, vowing never to let anyone close again. He spoke in a low, even tone, but Elara could hear the profound pain layered beneath the control. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that startled her. I tell you this so you understand the nature of the man you married." "I understand," she said softly. She reached out, her movement hesitant, and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath the fine wool of his coat. "You are not like her," he said, his voice rough. "You are honest." He covered her hand with his own. His fingers were long and cool, but his palm was warm, and his grip, when it closed around hers, was not confining, but grounding. It was a simple touch, but in the firelit silence of the library, it felt like the beginning of everything. The summons arrived 2 weeks later, an embossed invitation on heavy cream cardstock. The Duchess of Devonshire requested the pleasure of their company at her annual winter ball, the most anticipated social event of the London season. It was the public test Alistair had warned her of. To refuse would be to admit defeat, to give credence to the rumours Harrington was undoubtedly spreading. To accept was to walk into the lion's den. "We will go," Alistair said, his decision absolute. It is time they saw the Duchess of Blackwood. The journey to London was different this time. They travelled together in his private coach, the atmosphere one of quiet strategy rather than cold distance. In the Duke's London townhouse, a whirlwind of activity began. Modistes and jewellers were summoned. Alistair did not ask Ilara's opinion. He simply commissioned a gown of midnight blue silk, the colour of a twilight sky, and had the Blackwood diamonds brought up from the vault. When she saw herself in the mirror on the night of the ball, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The little grey mouse was gone, replaced by a duchess, her simple bun replaced with an elegant coiffure, the severe line of her jaw softened by the sparkle of diamonds at her throat. Alistair was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. He wore formal black evening attire, the starkness of it emphasizing his height and the severity of his handsome features. When he saw her, he stopped dead. For a long, silent moment, he simply looked at her, and in his slate-grey eyes she saw an unguarded admiration that made her heart beat faster than any of Harrington's false compliments ever had. He offered her his arm, and his touch was firm and reassuring. The ballroom at Devonshire House was a glittering sea of jewels, silks, and censure. As they were announced, a wave of whispers followed them, a rustle of speculation. Ilara could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, dissecting her, judging her. She kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm. They were a formidable pair, he, the dark, brooding Duke, emerging from his self-imposed exile, and she, the mysterious, unknown wife at his side. They found Harrington holding court near the orchestra, surrounded by a coterie of gossips. He saw them approach, his face a mask of smug triumph. "Ah, the Duke!" he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "And the blushing bride. How brave of you to show your face, Ilara. I have been telling everyone of your predicament." "There is no predicament, Harrington," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the chatter. But it was Ilara who stepped forward, disengaging from her husband's arm. She faced her former fiancé, her expression calm, her voice clear and steady. "Lord Harrington has been telling you a story," she said, addressing the circle of onlookers. "A story in which he is the hero, and I am a damsel in distress. I would like to tell you the truth." And she did. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep or plead. She simply stated the facts, laying them out with the cool precision of an accountant. She spoke of his debts, of the work she had done on his ledgers, of how he had used the illusion of solvency she created to secure a wealthier bride. She had memorized the key figures, the dates, the specific transactions. "Lord Harrington is not a rescuer," she concluded, her gaze unwavering. "He is a man who discards people when they are no longer useful to him." A man from the crowd, a known associate of the shipping magnate whose daughter Harrington was to marry, stepped forward. "Are you suggesting, madam, that Lord Harrington's finances are not what they seem?" "I am not suggesting it," Alara said calmly. "I am stating it as a fact I can substantiate with copies of his own ledgers." A gasp went through the crowd. Harrington's face was ashen. His entire house of cards was collapsing around him. Before he could retort, Alistair spoke, his voice resonating with quiet authority through the now silent ballroom. He did not defend her or add to the accusations against Harrington. He simply looked at Alara and then at the assembled company. "My wife, the Duchess of Blackwood," he said, "is the most competent and honourable person in this room. This estate, this house," he gestured vaguely northward, "thrives because of her. I thrive because of her." It was not a defence. It was a declaration, a public validation more powerful than any denial. The tide of opinion turned, swift and absolute. Harrington was ruined, exposed as a fraud and a cad. He stumbled away, his social standing shattered. The Duchess of Devonshire herself came forward, taking Alara's hand. "Welcome to London, Your Grace," she said, her smile genuine. Alistair took her arm again, and this time, when he looked at her, his severe expression had cracked, and beneath it was a look of profound, undisguised pride. They had won, together. The following spring found Blackwood Manor transformed. The grey stone walls seemed less forbidding, warmed by the pale northern sun. Life had returned to the gardens, which were now a riot of colour, daffodils, tulips, and the first tight buds of the roses they had saved together. The house, too, had changed. The dust covers were gone, the rooms were filled with light and fresh flowers, and the silence was no longer watchful, but peaceful. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency born of respect, not fear. It was a home. Alara and Alistair had found a new rhythm, one of comfortable partnership. They still spent their evenings in the library, but now they read passages aloud to one another or discussed plans for the estate over a shared pot of tea. The vast dining table had been abandoned in favour of a small round table set before the fire in the morning room, where they took all their meals together. One bright afternoon, they were working side by side in the walled garden, thinning out new seedlings. The sun was warm on Alara's back, and the scent of damp earth and new leaves filled the air. They worked in a familiar, companionable silence, their hands moving in concert. Alistair straightened up, wiping a smear of dirt from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at her, at the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her braid, at the smudge of soil on her cheek, and his expression was open, unguarded, in a way she had never seen before. "The contract is fulfilled, Alara," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the drone of a nearby bee. She paused, her trowel halfway to the soil, and looked up at him. "You have managed the household. You have satisfied society. The terms have been met." Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. For a terrifying moment, she thought he meant to end their arrangement, to send her away now that her purpose was served. He must have seen the fear in her eyes, because he took a step closer, his gaze intense. "But I find myself wishing to renegotiate," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "The original terms are no longer sufficient." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking over her soil-stained knuckles. "I did not account for this, for you." He looked around at the vibrant living garden, and then back at her. "You have brought this place back to life, and me along with it." He took a breath, and the words he spoke next were not flowery or poetic. They were plain, factual, and delivered with the same quiet certainty he used to discuss the weather or the price of grain. "I love you, Alara. It is the most undeniable fact of my existence." Tears pricked her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. The little grey mouse, the discarded asset, the competent duchess, all of those versions of herself fell away, leaving only the woman who was loved for exactly who she was. "And I love you, Alistair," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his severe face, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He drew her in, and there in the garden they had rebuilt together, surrounded by the new life they had nurtured, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. The final image was not of a duke and duchess, but of two people, their hands linked, one gloved in rich earth, the other scarred by an old wound, standing together in the sun. Finally, irrevocably home. Thank you for staying with us through Alara and Alistair's journey. Their story began with a contract, but ended in a partnership of the truest kind. Would you have trusted a man who bought your future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Remember, the best alliances often begin as the most honest transactions.